Okay, we are now going to move on to Module 18, and we're going to talk about a second type of learning, which is called operant conditioning. A little bit different from what we just talked about in Module 17 with classical conditioning. We're going to discuss two main researchers. We're going to talk about mainly Skinner, and we'll talk about positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. And then we'll also talk about schedules of reinforcement. But we'll historically go back and we'll talk about a really well-known study done by Thorndike with cats in what he called problem boxes. But there are two main questions that we're going to answer in Module 18. The first question is, what are the roles of reward and punishment in learning? Because both of these are very influential when it comes to an individual learning to do something. You either get rewarded, so you do that same behavior again, so that hopefully you will keep getting rewarded, or you are punished, so you are not going to do that behavior again because you want to avoid being punished. So we're going to talk about the roles that reward and punishment play in learning. And in the second question we're going to answer in this module is, what are some practical methods for bringing about behavior change, both within ourselves and within others? And I think this you'll really enjoy because it is applying it to your everyday life, not only for you to make changes, but for you to see changes in other people, the changes that you want to see with them. Okay, so let's start off talking about classical or operant conditioning. Excuse me. Let's start off talking about operant conditioning. And a basic definition is that we learn, learning takes place, in which a voluntary response is either strengthened or weakened, depending on the response's favorable or unfavorable consequences. So whatever response you make, you're either going to be rewarded or you're going to be punished. If you're rewarded, you do that response again. If you're punished, you don't do the response again. That's basically what operant conditioning has to deal with. That's very simple put on what operant conditioning is. Unlike classical conditioning, operant conditioning applies to voluntary responses that an organism performs deliberately. You know, when we were talking about classical conditioning, we were talking about reflexes and unconditioned stimuli and unconditioned responses. In operant conditioning, there is no reflexive response. It is everything that you intentionally do. You are doing something to bring about that response. So we like to say that the organism itself operates on its environment to produce some sort of desirable result. You're in control of the result, the response that you want to get whenever it comes to operant conditioning. Now, as I mentioned, I wanted to go back historically and talk about this really well-known study that Thorndike did. Edward Thorndike. He developed what is called the law of effect. And the law of effect states that responses that lead to satisfying consequences are more likely to be repeated. So you do something and you get rewarded for it, you're more likely to do that again in the future. According to Thorndike, over time and also through experience, the organism makes a direct connection between the stimulus and the response without any awareness that the connection exists. So I know this sounds a little bit like you're not voluntarily doing this, but Thorndike believed that you may make this connection between the stimulus and the response, but you may not actually be aware of it. But you do realize there is a connection there afterwards, and so you're more likely to make that response again. So this is Thorndike's original study. He called this the puzzle box. I've also heard it called the problem box, but the puzzle box is what it's referred to here. So what Thorndike did is he took cats and he put them in this box. And you can see if you look, there's a little lever hanging on a string. If you pull this lever, it's going to open this door and the cat can escape and get a treat. So what Thorndike did is he put the cats in the box and he let them roam around, and eventually the cats would start pushing or playing with that block with the string, and they push on it, with a little bit of exertion, and the door would open. The cats would escape and they would get a treat. He put them back in the box again, and it would take a little bit less time for the cats to realize that all they had to do was push on this block, the string, the lever would go up, and the door would release. After a couple trials, as soon as he put those cats in the box, they went right over to the lever, or right over to the block, pushed the block, the string pushed the lever, and the cats were released. So you see, they voluntarily did something and they got rewarded for it. The lever opened up the door and they got rewarded with a treat. So they're more likely to do those things again. And you can see here it says on the thing that, do you think Thorndike's work has relevance to the question of why people voluntarily work on puzzles and play games, such as Sudoku, Angry Birds, jigsaw puzzles? Do they receive any rewards? I don't know if I necessarily have a right or wrong answer to that, but sometimes I think there is some intrinsic motivation to finishing a puzzle, right? Or to moving on to the next level of Angry Birds, or being able to figure out the Sudoku. And then you go to a harder level, and so on and so forth. So I do think it can be applied to situations that we currently have in our environment, such as with these puzzles. So let's go back historically. Again, not as historical as Thorndike, but we're going back to historically operant conditioning, and we're going to talk about B.F. Skinner. The same way that Pavlov and Watson were very well known for classical conditioning, B.F. Skinner is kind of like seen as the father of operant conditioning. And he developed what is known as a Skinner box. So this is an electronic chamber that's hooked up to a computer. It's a very controlled environment. You're setting up and you're controlling the whole situation. And he used these Skinner boxes in the laboratory to train animals with operant conditioning. So what he did is he used rats. He made them hungry, right? So they would go so many hours without food so that they were hungry, so that they would want to work towards getting fed. And he taught those rats to push a lever in this Skinner box, and then this treat would come down through a tube into a dish, and they'd be able to eat the treat. After a couple of trials, the rats would immediately push the lever, get the treat, push the lever, get the treat. So you can see they were getting reinforced positively for pushing that lever. At first, what happens is the rat may accidentally press the lever as it's just walking around and exploring the environment, and it gets this food pellet or this treat. The same way that the cats were just exploring the puzzle box and may have accidentally started to play with that block and the string, and the door was released and they got a treat. So at first it is an accidental pressing of the lever. However, they got reinforced. They got a food pellet. So at first it may not make the connection, but over time it's going to press the lever again and again and again, and each time it presses the lever, it's going to increase the frequency that they're going to get this food pellet. So before you know it, they're in there pressing that lever like crazy so that they get a food pellet every time. We'll talk about schedules of reinforcement later on in this module, talking about how often they have to press the lever to get reinforced and so on and so forth. This is a picture of, on the right, this is actually B.F. Skinner, and this is what the Skinner box looks like. I have used these numerous times whenever I was in graduate school to train rats to press a lever. But you can see this is a real rat in the picture on the right, but a cartoon rat on the picture on the left showing you that they had to press this lever and then food would come down into this tray and they would be able to eat the food. There's lots of things that you can do with these Skinner boxes. You see that there are two lights, a green light and a red light. You know, if the green light comes on, they press the lever and they get food. If the red light comes on and they press the lever, they may not get food. So you can train them to recognize the difference or discrimination between these two lights. This is also an electronic grid on the floor, and you can instill fear in the rats by shocking them with this grid. So there's lots of things that you can do with these Skinner boxes. I use Skinner boxes with both rats and pigeons in graduate school. All right, so let's talk about some of the central components or the central concept of operant conditioning. You heard me say this word reinforce all the time, right? As we were going through these previous slides. Let's talk about what reinforcement actually means. Reinforcement is a process by which a stimulus increases the likelihood or the probability that the preceding behavior will be repeated. If you get reinforced, you're going to repeat that behavior again. The reinforcer is any stimulus that increases the probability that the preceding behavior will occur again. So the reinforcer in the problem box or in the puzzle box was the door being lifted and the cat's getting a treat. The reinforcer in the Skinner box is that a food pellet comes down and they get to eat. We have a difference between primary and secondary reinforcers. A primary reinforcer satisfies some sort of biological need that you need for survival. And it works naturally regardless of previous experience. So a good example of a primary reinforcer is food. You need food in order to survive. And so if you are hungry, you are going to work very hard in order to be reinforced with food. So a primary reinforcer is something that you need for survival. Food, water, sex, sleep. All of those things you need for survival. Now, a secondary reinforcer is something that you use in order to get the primary reinforcer. So if your primary reinforcer is food, what do you need in order to get food? Most of the time, you need money. So money is a great example of a secondary reinforcer because you're going to use that money in order to get the primary reinforcer. These are also in behavioral training, they're called token economies or token systems. You know, this is used a lot of times in rehab hospitals. If you do something well and you don't get in trouble, you may get a token. For every so many tokens you get, you're going to get time to make a phone call. Or for every so many tokens, you may get a cigarette break or whatever it is. So that's called a token economy. It is a secondary reinforcer that you use in order to get the primary reinforcer. Excuse me. All right, let's talk about positive reinforcers, negative reinforcers, and punishment. I want you to write something down before we start on this, okay? So write down these 4 things. Reinforcement means you want the behavior to occur again. Punishment means you do not want the behavior to occur again. Positive means that you're giving, and negative means that you're taking away. Okay? Those 4 things you wrote down. Reinforcement means you want the behavior to occur again. Punishment means you do not want the behavior to occur again. Positive means you're giving. Negative means you're taking away. If you know those 4 things, I can guarantee you, you will have no trouble with positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. Okay, so a positive reinforcer is when something is given or added to the environment that increases the likelihood of the behavior occurring again. Positive means you're giving, reinforcement means you want the behavior to occur again. And with positive reinforcement, you're usually giving something good, something the individual wants. Now, negative reinforcement is a little bit different because it doesn't sound right. But think about those 4 things you wrote down. So with negative reinforcer, it's where this unpleasant stimulus is taken away, which leads to the likelihood that you're going to perform the behavior again. So you're usually taking away something bad, something the individual does not like. But remember, it's reinforcement, so you want the behavior to occur again. So remember, negative reinforcement is not the same as punishment. So positive reinforcement may be getting money for good grades. Let's say that you get $10 for every A that you get on your report card. You're giving something the person likes, money, in order to increase the likelihood that they are going to continue to get good grades. Negative reinforcement. Let's say that you have chores to do, and no one likes doing chores, right? So your parents tell you that for every A you get, they're going to take away 3 chores for a month. See how they're taking away an unpleasant stimulus. They're taking away chores to increase the likelihood that the behavior is going to occur again, that you're going to continue to get good grades. Now, punishment is a stimulus that decreases the likelihood that the behavior will occur again. You do not want the behavior to occur again. Remember, you wrote down those 4 things. So punishment is where you do not want the behavior to occur again. Now, with punishment, there are 2 types of punishment, right? There is positive and there is negative punishment. Remember, positive means that you're giving something, negative means that you're taking something away. But now you're doing this in order to decrease the likelihood that that behavior is going to occur again. So with positive punishment, this is another weird one like negative reinforcement because you think that it doesn't make sense. But positive punishment is going to weaken any response through the application of an unpleasant stimulus. So positive is giving, punishment means you want to decrease the likelihood. So you're going to be given something to decrease the likelihood of the behavior occurring again. And usually you are given something that you do not like. So spanking is an example of positive punishment. You are given a spanking to decrease the likelihood that you will hit your sister again. Negative punishment, again, you're taking something away to decrease the likelihood. And usually you are taking something away the person likes. That's being punished. So perhaps your parents are taking away your video games to decrease the likelihood that you're going to hit your sister again. So again, remember, if you know those 4 things, reinforcement, punishment, positive, and negative, if you know those 4 things, you should have no trouble with learning positive and negative reinforcement. So this is figure 3 in your textbook. And this is on page, well, I'm not sure what page it's on. Maybe it's not a page. Maybe it's just showing you. I guess it's not a page, but it's a really nice table. I thought this was it says figure 3, so I don't know why. Oh, it is here. Sorry. It is at the top of page 6. The top of page 6 goes through these various positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. So increasing the behavior occurring again is reinforcement. Positive is you're giving something, right? Something good. You're given a raise for good performance. The result is that you're going to continue to perform well. Negative is you're taking something away, something that you don't like. So applying ointment to relieve an itchy rash leads to the likelihood that in the future, whenever you have a rash, you're again going to apply the ointment because you want to take away that itchiness. Punishment is where you're decreasing the behavior. So positive is where you're giving something. So you yell at a teenager when she steals a bracelet. The teenager doesn't want to get yelled at, so she decreases the likelihood of stealing a bracelet again. Negative is you're restricting a teenager's access to a car due to breaking curfew. Your parents tell you that you should be home at 12 midnight and you get home at 2 a.m. They take away your car keys for a month, decreasing the likelihood that you're going to miss curfew again. So the pros and cons of using punishment and why reinforcement will always beat out punishment. So let's think about the pros of punishment first. Is it appropriate for dangerous behaviors? Yes, it could be. If your child is running out into the street and could possibly get hit by a car, yelling and spanking them may be appropriate to scare them to not run out into the street again. Another pro of punishment is that it is a temporary suppression. This temporary suppression provides an opportunity to reinforce more desirable behaviors. So in order to not do those again, that leaves you more room to be rewarded. Now, let's think about the cons of punishment. Punishment is frequently ineffective. The older you get, the more ineffective it gets. Punished behavior may be replaced by even less desirable behavior. Physical punishment can cause harm. You know, there's a difference between spanking someone and beating their bottom to where you left welts or bruises. So physical punishment can actually be harmful. Punishment can also lead to fear and a lowered self-esteem. And punishment also does not relay information about some alternative, more desirable behavior that you want to see. So you have to keep these in mind with the pros and cons of punishment. You know, we only have 2 pros, but we have 5 different cons. I'm not saying that punishment is bad and that you should never use it. However, if you could use more reinforcement and show them an alternative and give them reinforcement for the alternative, that would probably be more effective than just punishing them. Okay, let's think about schedules of reinforcement. So we just talked about reinforcement and punishment, right? Now we're just going to focus on reinforcement. And we have various schedules of reinforcement that can be used. When we think about schedules of reinforcement, it's a pattern of frequency and timing of the reinforcement following a desired behavior. If you are on a continuous reinforcement schedule, that means that you reinforce the behavior every single time that it occurs. If you are on a partial reinforcement schedule, that means you reinforce a behavior sometimes, but not all of the time. So continuous is that you get reinforced every single time. Partial means that sometimes you get reinforced, sometimes you don't get reinforced. The partial reinforcement schedule maintains a longer performance because you don't know that you're going to get reinforced every single time. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And so it's going to prolong your performance schedule. Okay, let's talk about these schedules of reinforcement. There are 4 different schedules of reinforcement. And again, I want you to write down 4 things, just like I had you do with reinforcement and punishment. The 4 things that I want you to write down with the schedules of reinforcement, okay? Fixed means exact. Variable means that it varies. It's based on an average. Ratio means responses, and interval means time. Okay? Fixed means exact every single time. Variable means that it varies. It's based on an average. Ratio means that you're talking about responses, and interval means that you're talking about time. If you know those 4 things, you should have no trouble with the schedules of reinforcement. So let's start talking about them. The first one is a fixed ratio schedule. The reinforcement is given only after a specific number of responses are made. Remember, it's exact, it's specific. So if you do, we call it piecework, right? Let's say that you work in a warehouse, and for every 100 boxes that you pack, you get an extra $5. You know exactly what you need to do in order to get reinforced. You have to pack 100 boxes. So it's a fixed ratio schedule. A variable ratio schedule is that the reinforcement occurs after an average number of responses. So let's say that a good example of this is playing a slot machine. You are not rewarded every single time you put a quarter in the machine. You may be reinforced one time, and then you may not be reinforced for 10 more plays. And then maybe you're reinforced after 2 plays, and then you're being reinforced after 30 plays, and then so on and so forth. So when you were reinforced, it varies. It's all based on an average. So if a FR 100, right, that means 100 boxes before you get reinforced. If it is a VR 100, you may get reinforced after 25 responses, and then maybe after 75 responses, and then maybe after 36 responses, and then maybe after 82 responses. It's all based on an average. The crucial factor in both of these is the number of responses. Okay, so that is ratio schedules, both fixed and variable. The next thing I want to talk about is The interval schedules. Remember, interval means time. We still have fixed and we still have variable, but now we're talking about time. So a fixed interval schedule is that reinforcement is provided for a response only after a fixed amount of time has passed. So if it is FI 20 minutes, you will not be reinforced until 20 minutes has passed. If you're paid on a weekly schedule, you know you're not going to get your paycheck until 7 days has passed. Now, variable interval means that you will be reinforced, but after a varying amount of time has passed. Again, it's based on an average. So if it is FI 20 minutes, right, that means that after 20 minutes has passed, you're going to get reinforced. If it is VI 20 minutes, that means you may be reinforced after 5 minutes. You may be reinforced after 18 minutes. You may be reinforced after 2 minutes. You may be reinforced after 13 minutes. You will be reinforced, but it's an average of 20 minutes for that one. So just like the crucial factor with ratio schedules was the amount of responses or the number of responses, the crucial factor with intervals is the amount of time that has elapsed since the reward. This figure, figure 4, you can find at the top of page 185. And you can see this shows you in graph form the various types of schedules. So here's the fixed ratio, right? You know exactly what you need to do in order to get reinforced. So there are relatively short pauses in responding after reinforcement is provided because you know you're going to get reinforced right away again. With the variable ratio, the responding occurs at a high, steady rate. You are constantly pressing the lever because you may have to press it 10 times, you may have to press it 20 times, and you may have to press it 2 times. Then you may have to press it 30 times. So you're constantly pressing that lever because it's based on an average. You don't know when you're going to get reinforced. The fixed interval schedule. These are typically long pauses because it doesn't matter how many times you respond. The only response that matters is after the time has passed. So if it is FI 2 minutes, you could sit there and do absolutely nothing for 2 minutes. But as soon as 2 minutes is up, you respond and you get reinforced. So you're not going to see as much behavior, let's say, in a fixed interval. A variable interval, responding occurs again at a steady rate because you don't know when you're going to get reinforced. Perhaps it's 2 minutes, perhaps it's 15 minutes, perhaps it's 11 minutes, then it's 18 minutes, so on and so forth. All right, I want to talk next about discrimination and generalization in operant conditioning. Remember, we talked about these two previously with classical conditioning. Now I want to talk about them with operant conditioning. And so we have two different things to think about. One is stimulus control training. This is where behavior is reinforced in the presence of a specific stimulus, but not in its absence. So the stimulus has got to be there in order for you to be reinforced. If it's absent, you're not going to be reinforced. There's also a discriminative stimulus that signals the likelihood that reinforcement will follow a response. So you have two different types of stimulus training or stimulus control training. I don't want to say that. Two different types of training where your responses occur after varying degrees. So stimulus control training, their stimulus has got to be there for you to be reinforced. Discriminative stimulus is that you can you can signal the likelihood that a certain reinforcement will follow a response. You can discriminate between the two. Shaping procedures are very effective when you have a lot of stuff to learn in order to be reinforced. So when reinforcement doesn't come naturally. Shaping is where you reinforce a behavior every step along the way until you get the desired behavior. It may not be helpful in order to go from 0 to 100. Perhaps you have to go to 0 to 5, then 5 to 10, then 10 to 15, and you're going to reinforce that behavior every step along the way until you get to 100. So it's the process of teaching a complex behavior by rewarding closer and closer approximations of the desired behavior. So you start by reinforcing any behavior that is similar to the behavior you want to see. Then it starts becoming a little bit more difficult. Then you're not responding just every behavior, but you reinforce only responses that are closer to the behavior you want to reach. So now it's not just where you are reinforcing similar, but only those behaviors that are getting closer to the desired behavior. Finally, you only reinforce the desired behavior. And this is where it would be much more difficult to just go right to the desired behavior. So perhaps you could use this in potty training. You're not going to teach a kid to pee on the potty the first time. So perhaps you reinforce them for going into the bathroom. And then you reinforce them for, taking their pants off. Then you reinforce them for sitting on the potty. Then you reinforce them, so on and so forth, until you're reinforcing them for peeing on the potty. Each step moves only slightly beyond the previous learned behavior. You shape that behavior. Now, we do have some problems, though. One of those problems are the biological constraints. You can't teach an old dog just any trick. The saying goes, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. What we're talking about is you can't teach an old dog just any trick. So not all behaviors can be trained in all species the same way. Different species have built-in limitations to learn particular behaviors. Those biological constraints are consistent with evolutionary explanations of behavior. Remember when we talked about previously how evolution takes a very long time to occur, right? We could be talking about hundreds of years. So the reason why an organism may behave one way is because it was advantageous for them to do that previously for their ancestors. So those constraints are put in place by an evolutionary explanation. They may have been adaptive for survival. So the associations that animals learn most readily involve stimuli that are relevant to the specific environment in which they live. And that's to say whether you're talking about dogs or cats or fish or primates or humans, right? The associations have to be most readily available to where that organism lives, their environment. You have to keep in mind that we may be genetically predisposed to be fearful of certain stimuli. So you have to take into account the environment. All right, figure 5, this is on page 188 in your textbook. And there's a picture that goes along with this. But this just gives you the basic principles, the nature of behavior, the order of events, and an example with both classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So this is just kind of like an overview table of everything we've talked about in both Module 17 and in Module 18 then. I think it's just a really helpful table to study if you're studying for the exam and trying to keep these concepts in place. The last thing that I want to talk about in Module 18 is behavior modification. Behavior modification is used when you want to change some behavior, either from usually from an undesirable behavior to a more desirable behavior. That is when we use behavior modification. So it is a technique for promoting the frequency of desirable behaviors and decreasing the incidence of unwanted behaviors. So use behavior modification when you want to see more desirable behaviors and not see undesirable behaviors. So there are typical steps involved with behavior modification. And we're going to talk about these 6 different steps that are involved. The first one is to identify the goals and the target behaviors. That's what you have to start out with first. What is the desirable behavior that you want to see? What is the goal that you want achieved? You then design a data recording system and record preliminary data. After you record that preliminary data, maybe you just look at the behavior that's occurring naturally, right? Then you want to select a behavior change strategy. So here's the end goal. Second, here's what's currently occurring. Third, this is the change that I want to see. Then the fourth thing that you want to do is you want to implement the program. You want to keep careful records after the program is implemented. And then later you want to evaluate and alter the program. On page 189 and 190 in your textbook, they give a lot of good examples for this. It's in one of those sections, Becoming an Informed Consumer of Psychology, and it talks about using behavior analysis for behavior modification. And it's very helpful, I think, if you read through it, and then for each of these 6, they also give an example for each one, which I think is going to be very helpful for you to actually apply it also.